Good morning. My name is Sandrine Sanos, and it's a pleasure to be here among such impressive historians. So what I'd like to do before we begin our conversation is just very briefly introduce everyone, and I'll do so in alphabetical order. So first we have Alice Bullard. Hello, Alice. And Alice is a historian who's been now a practicing human rights lawyer and has published most recently on human rights in Mauritania. Next, we have Judy Coffin. Hello, Judy.
Good morning, everyone.
I'd like to know that Judy's new book, Sex, Love and Letters, Writing Simone de Beauvoir, is forthcoming in September with Cornell University Press. We'll be waiting eagerly. Then my pleasure in welcoming Sarah Fishman.
Hello. Hi.
Hello, Sarah. And your most recent book was From Vichy to the Sexual Revolution, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2017. And last, Jean Pedersen. Hello.
Hi, it's so nice to see everybody here, and what a privilege to be on this panel.
It is, and I'd like to note as well that you've published quite numerous articles in the recent years on gender, Tocqueville, Auguste Comte, among others. Welcome, everyone. So it's been a delight to have a panel focused explicitly or implicitly on feminism, which reminds us that feminism is really always plural and always a much more complicated and ambivalent history than we tend to yearn for or imagine, that it's never a given. And I think that's what these papers show us very well. And I think in every instance, we've seen how paying attention to a particular historical deployment of feminism or feminist thinking or engagement with feminism raises a number of important questions for us as historians. So what I'd like to begin is just to hear from every single one of you what you think about how, when you turn to your object of study, your figure, what historiographical questions did you think that particular object of study raised, or in the process of thinking about whether it's figures like Auclair or Riage, or a multitude of fascinating figures, Jean, or thinking about dialogues amongst feminists for Alice. So what are the big problématiques, to use the French word, that you think your work raised?
Well, I'll hop in because I think I started with one problématique and then I ended up with another problématique which I have not solved yet. So the problématique that I knew I was thinking about was the question of the relationship between the national and the international. Especially going back and forth between the United States and France, especially going back and forth between Rochester and Paris, I gradually came to realize that feminists before me, for over 100 years had made the same trajectory. And I started thinking about how interesting it was that most of the books about feminism I knew were either books about American feminism by American historians, books by French feminism by French historians, or of course there is a certain amount of work on transnational feminism. Layla Rupp's Worlds of Women come to mind, but it goes from an organizational or institutional perspective rather than from the pretty biographical perspective that I have ended up taking myself. But that being said, because it turned out that so much of the most important French participation in the International Council of Women was associated with Geneviève de Sainte-Croix and her work against trafficking and her work against regulated prostitution, it has very quickly led me to the very contentious question of feminists' relationship to sex work. Whether this is a kind of work that feminists should be getting rid of because it is ineluctably bad work, or whether it is a kind of work that feminists should be supporting because it could be better work with paid vacations and sick days and retirement schemes as part of the welfare state. And you look around the world and there is no consensus on this question. And I do not have an answer to this question, but I think you can see waves of feminist scholarship, and most recently, Elisa Camasholi's double award-winning article now on whether there are alternatives to thinking about women in these professions as agents or victims or something more complicated, and then what kinds of policy proposals to develop from there. That is my big problematique right now. Thank you.
Should I jump in? Yeah. This makes me, I'm very happy to hear Jean talk about this, because the very first thing I ever published was on exactly this question about prostitution in the Radical History Review 100 years ago. And I bugged all of my friends. I would, we'd go out to dinner. I'd say, okay, so what do you think? What should feminists think about prostitution? Anyway, it's fun. I'll send it to you.
Please.
I think, let me say, I think I have two problematiques, if you will. The one is, I think, inspired by Joan, among other people. I always think of feminism as coming out of, or whatever we want to call feminism, coming out of a particular discursive moment or a particular cultural logic, and I was interested in thinking through that. And the second was the thing that got me started on this in the first place, was seeing this dialogue between Henri and Beauvoir and thinking, why in the world don't we ever think of these two characters together? Right? Part of it is sexuality as something of the, and particularly the kind of sexuality that's issue in story about pornography and eroticism, as something of a third rail of feminist politics in the not just the 20th century, in the 19th century. So that isn't really an issue in this paper, but that's one of the things that I'm interested in this project.
I guess I'll jump in next. And I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm working on sort of a dual biography of Auclair along with Marcel Segal, one Marie Claire, one Al. And having spent many years looking through women's magazines as one of my sources for two of my projects now, this whole issue of how they relate to women's lives. Are they trying to sort of mold women into a particular way of being that is sort of focused on family and men and appearance, or is there some way in which we can think differently a little bit about them, at least particularly in this period of time? And so, like I say, through the person of Auclair and the way in which she used Marie Claire, again, it's not all or nothing. I think that the reality is very complicated, and so I wouldn't say that these magazines are feminist in any way, and they do focus on love and family and children, but there's these other elements of it. And then Auclair herself, and one of the reasons is that she continued working during Vichy, and so a friend of mine in France sort of was dismissive of her as, sort of having been tainted by Vichy. And so that's why I went through every single issue of the magazine during the war to see exactly what she had been saying. So again, if you sort of dismiss her because she was working during Vichy, then you're going to miss all of this other stuff that, that she was involved in. Those I think are the two issues, the press, the women's magazines in general, and then her personal trajectory.
Thank you, Sarah. Alice?
Hi. Well, thank you. This is wonderful to be here with everyone, and I'm just really excited to talk about everyone's work. I see a lot of continuities, and want to talk about where the important historiographical transitions are. I mean, the one featured in my paper, of course, is between what you might think of kind of old-fashioned rights campaigning feminism, such as we find in some of the papers on our panel, versus what I call the Scottian style which is very different. And I wanted to ask Joan if that's the third rail that she's talking about, or something like that. But so my real concerns, partly coming out of the fact that I am a lawyer, is this injury to religious sentiment and as a legal category, and that I actually think as a lawyer that misogyny is an injury to religious sentiment and needs to emerge in terms of historical recognition. It needs to emerge as a category of analysis and thinking within the academy. And I'm also really interested in the image and the kind of unspeakable real. And maybe some of you might know that I work in the history of psychiatry and psychoanalysis. And I haven't published in that in a little while, but I'm about to sign a book contract to do a book on Dakar and spirit crises in Dakar, where I worked in the Fan Hospital there. And so I'm interested in my presentation where I talk about the image that Joan Scott is talking about, the image generated in international politics of the kind of sexy bikini-clad pinup girl, and then the realities, how the image is not real. The image is not real, although it's powerful, although it's very powerful. And I think of that myself in psychoanalytic terms of the image and the unspeakable real, which I don't know if any of you ever are Lacanians, but I'm tapping into that kind of understanding of, and that so many in each of our papers, there's an unspeakable, there are the anonymous letters that are unspeakable. These lives are literally unspeakable in certain ways. So I'm really interested in that.
Thank you, Alice. So it seems this is a perfect moment to transition to thinking about, since you raised this question. So there's a very interesting ways in which religion appears in all papers as culture, as sort of a discursive regime, Catholicism. Jean, you have a number of Protestant and Catholic figures. So I wonder sort of how that became something that was to be addressed, troubled in terms of thinking within French history, within histories of feminism, and in thinking about what we're trying to unearth about the kinds of arguments made about the body, labor, sex, whether it's the pleasures of the body or whether it's sex work. So I was wondering if you could say something about this, if anyone would like to begin.
It's go ahead.
I'm sorry, just because she was in this sort of, it's really unfortunate. I took a video of while I was watching it at the Inatek at the VNF, and I couldn't get the images to translate onto a screen. But it's very confrontational with this archbishop, and yet she's known as sort of Catholic, and she was. And she wasn't at the same time. So she's sort of, her personality, her personal journey really complicates that. She didn't go to church for 25 years, then she went back. She read, Gandhi and Bhagavad Gita and some of these, she dabbled in all kinds of Hinduism, all kinds of things. So she had this very broad spiritual element of her life. But the church itself and its policies really obviously pissed her off. So I think, she saw it as a powerful force, and she felt like she could take it on. And so she did.
Maybe I should jump in because my character turns out to be quite closely related to Sarah's, though I don't think either of us thought that. I've never thought very much about religion, and now I understand just how much I have to, just how much the universe of all of these characters is stuffed with religious imagery, and how much shadow boxing there is with a really, I don't even know how to yet have the language for it, a really vivid and dark version of Catholicism. So Teresa of Avila, for instance,
right. one of their biographies she wrote. Yeah,
exactly. And then I found out just 2 days ago. I think I was Googling Marcelle Auclair because I'm a big fan of hers as well. Well, she's written a biography of her.
yes.
Teresa d'Avila is all over the second sex. Who would have thought it? And is plainly in some, way the template for O in Story of O. So this wrestling with Catholicism in the aftermath of the war, although, and I think Sandrine may take us there, I don't think this is all just about the aftermath of the war. It's plainly very, very important.
Right. Yeah, she'd stopped attending Mass before the war. She got pissed off at a confession, something some priest said to her, and so she stopped going to Mass for 25 years. So yeah.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, Alice.
I just wanted to remark on this question of Catholicism that the situation really hasn't changed since. I mean, the secular space allows other things to come to the fore and other life forms to happen, but the Catholic Church itself is still where it was.
Right, but
like with the recent exposure of a whole convent that was serving as sex slaves in France. I don't know if that news went by you guys or whether you all caught it a few years ago. But I collect these kind of stories that it hasn't really changed. And so that's the kind of long-term patriarchy that is my focus, even though other things are also happening, like a lot of other things are also happening in history, that continuity is still there.
Just to jump in though, the practice of Catholicism just fell off a cliff. The number of people who attend Mass weekly in France is like minuscule. So it has less social power, even though it hasn't necessarily changed its point of view on sex. Oh
yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's what I mean by a lot of other things are happening too.
Right. Okay.
The institution is still there. The teachings are still there. The dogma is still there, and and there's more religion than just Catholicism.
Right.
There are a lot of other religions. But it is true that agnosticism is increasing in prevalence. I had that as a statistic and had to take it out of my slides because I didn't have the copyright for it. I think it's a Pew study that I was looking to.
I mean, this raises the question, and I think sort of my question was about framing. So there's the Catholic Church as an institution embedded in French history, and that itself is not monolithic. Sort of while theology may not have moved, as you suggest, I mean, I think historians of colonial and decolonization would suggest there's ways in which the Catholic Church has a story that also needs to be complicated in this relationship. And then I think there's the question of the culture that the sort of the cultural logic, to borrow your word, Judy, and then the practice that can be, that we see how people both turn to religion, subvert it, and that's always been a story with women and feminists in religion. And I think, Jean, you bring up something else as well, and I know you wanted to speak to this.
Yes, so enter the Protestants, the Protestant feminists in particular that I wrote about in my paper. Isabelle Bachelot, Marie Dabadi d'Arrast, and Jeanne-Avril de Sainte-Croix, I believe, was not practicing Protestant, but certainly moved in very heavily Protestant circles. Mm-hmm. If we think about the American roots in Rochester, we could think about Unitarians, and we could think about Quakers as being very important in the American anti-slavery movement and mm-hmm. the American women's movement that came out of the anti-slavery movement. And we could think about Susan B. Anthony's colleague, Elisabeth Cady Stanton, and how one of her big projects was the creation of what she called a women's Bible, which is what I would call an annotated Bible, where they went through book by book and started with things like God creating Eve out of Adam's rib, and what does that mean for women? Well, there's another creation story where God creates them both at the same time, and that's the important one. They highlight moments in the Old Testament where there are strong female figures, and they critique moments in the Old Testament where women are mistreated. And one of the most interesting things, Alice, when you were talking about the old-fashioned legal rights approach, I think back to the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 that came out of Seneca Falls, and one of the things that has always interested me the most about it is that these women asked not only for the right to vote and the right to serve as witnesses and as guardians and the right to divorce and the right to education and the right to the professions, but the right to the ordained ministry, the right to speak out of the pulpit. I think that's not something that you necessarily hear those two things together so often. That combination has always interested me. And so French Protestants that I ended up looking at, I want to specify French Protestant feminists. They are both on the one hand very Protestant, and I'm starting to think that perhaps one of the reasons that they were able to work so closely with the International Council of Women is that perhaps Protestantism became a bridge for them across national differences and language differences and culture differences. I don't have the evidence for that yet, but the slogan of the International Council of Women to this day is "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you." And it doesn't get more Protestantly biblical than that, I feel, even if it's in Latin on their brochure and not in a more readily accessible language. But then also I know that in France itself, they had to fight with Protestant denominations in France about whether or not it was appropriate for good Protestant women to speak about sex, whether or not it was appropriate for good Protestant women to speak in public at all. And I think if you look at Florence Rochefort's work on feminism and Protestantism, what you see is that already these women tend to come out of very specific subsets of Protestantism, and they're less likely to come from the official Concordat recognized churches and more likely to come out of independent congregations, and that they both express themselves and struggle to express themselves. I think it's not an accident that Geneviève Pujol wrote the history of them on Feminisme sous tutelle, feminism under guardianship, how they both act and are constrained. So religion and feminism, that can mean a lot of different things, depending which religion and which feminism, and even within a denomination, which part of that denomination.
It's complicated, right?
It's so complicated. That's my favorite phrase in life. It's complicated.
No, I
Well,
was going to
Eastman
ask
wants
you
to make it
about that topic.
So, sorry, Alice, could you?
I was going to ask Jean precisely what she just spoke to. So that was all just very, very interesting.
Yes, and I think it speaks to, I think, Sarah, I'm looking at your paper, the ways in which, if we think about religion and feminism, or what you raised, Jean, that how in every single paper, what we have is, Sarah, you talk about how Eau Claire complicates usual categories, suggests that we expand our boundaries of what we assume to be within the purview of feminism, or how we define feminism. So picking up on what you said, Jean, I was wondering, is there, I mean, yours is a clearly transnational story, and you make a case for the fact that we cannot think through historically without thinking about the transnational. So while these figures are both very rooted in thinking about the nation, or steeped in sort of something that is about Frenchness or the nation, they always are engaged in, maybe we need to trouble the always, but they're engaged in transnational conversations, whether they have a transnational orientation, an explicit transnational orientation or not. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, that's very clear in your case, Jean. I was wondering how that, and I think it appears in the dialogue Alice is putting forth, but how do you see it in the case of Eau Claire and Ori? Sort of that question of nation, transnational or not.
Judy, you want to take a shot at that?
Gosh, I think, well, you know, it's interesting because she's at once a very cosmopolitan figure and super widely read and interested in bringing in conversations from other countries, but at the same time, I think very, very, very French. I mean, my question for Jean would be, why why do these characters believe so fervently in internationalism? Because I think that you know, that may not be there in quite the same way for Auclair and Henri. And how much that has to do, Jean, with just the, you know, kind of downside of this, how much it has to do with sort of international networks of colonialism and, you know, speaking as white feminists to others. That seems to me part of what makes them believe so fervently in internationalism.
If I could, with Auclair, she actually grew up in Chile. Family moved there when she was 5, and her father was an architect and helped rebuild after a huge earthquake. So she started schooling in Spanish. She spent a year in the US, went to school at a Protestant school in the US for a year, which she liked much better than the Catholic school she'd been at in Chile. And so she maintained those ties. In fact, she was very closely tied also to Federico Garcia Lorca. She wrote a biography of him. Turns out that her attempts to get documents on him were part of what caused a dossier to be compiled by the government, which they then thought, oh, we can't send this to her, and it just popped back up in 2015. So she sees herself more as a global figure than just as a strictly French figure, and does a lot of, she translated Garcia Lorca's plays. She translated this book that just cracks me up, La Force Pensée, by William Atkinson, one of these American late 19th century, you know, power of the brain kind of people. She translated that guy into French. Can't remember the title in English, but anyway, so she just, at least, I'm not so sure how well it comes across, but she definitely has a more global perspective.
Alice, did you want to add anything?
Hi. On religion, are we still in religion, or are we on exceptionalism?
I think we're on internationalism, and I want to hop in after you.
My paper is completely international because I work from my own logic is that of globalization. And so, like, I did a lot of work in post-colonialism. I'm old now as a graduate student, and my first book is really in that kind of colonial, post-colonial. And then my history of transcultural psychiatry is in post-colonial. But really, my matrix now is globalization, which is, we live in a completely internationalized world. And, you know, migration patterns and organizations and capital flows, it's all globalized in various dimensions, even though the post-colonial, just like the post-colonial emerges during colonialism, the globalized doesn't mean the post-colonial moment is over by any means, but there are these other currents. So anyway, I don't see how I could talk about what I talk about not internationally, and especially when you're talking about how divine law dispossesses women. And there are contemporary writers in, you know, like religious studies, and I suppose historians of religion might discuss this, but they're kind of sidelined out of a milieu like ours. Like, nobody here is a historian of religion. But there are people breaking from religion, from any number of faiths, who do this heavily critical work where they talk about being attacked on the incredibly personal level by divine law that subjugates them. So this isn't international. This happens internationally. It happens in all sorts of different religions. And I think we can't understand it just talking about one place. That it does a disservice to it as a power structure and as something that women confront. And my point of view is frankly feminist. Like, I'm not gonna make any bones about it. I'm interested in feminism. I'm interested in women's rights in relationship to this issue. And it needs to be discussed internationally. The politics of it are international. The politics of it are multicultural. So yes.
You clearly make a case for you sort of having what you call a global, and I think Judy raised the question is, how does this long history that we see with Jean, how can it be divorced from thinking about colonialism and its historical vagaries and the politics of race and sex and gender and how they've always shaped feminism? And I know you wanted to say something, Jean?
Yeah, I was thinking, I suppose this will connect specifically to the relationship between feminism and imperialism, or the relationship between religion and missionary activity. I would say, perhaps the most interesting moment to me of all of the moments that I read about as I was plowing through the digitized copies of the proceedings of the International Council of Women, which were what were available to me in this COVID world as I was doing the hard research for this paper, is the moment where the International Council of Women decides that they are no longer going to call their commission on white slave traffic and unified moral standard. They're going to change that. They're going to call it the Commission on Unified Moral Standard and Traffic in Women. And there are just tantalizing little pieces, which I assume with more research I will be able to figure out who all these different described and yet in the record anonymous speakers are. There's apparently a woman from Japan who objects to the phrase white slave trade. Mm-hmm. There's apparently an African-American woman who objects to the phrase white slave trade. And there's a whole panel, actually, that includes African-American voices in a different section that I haven't had a chance to read carefully, but I know there will be a lot to find there. And yet, at the same time, I think it is important that they object. It is also important that the organization responds. That Eugénie Avril de Santa Croix immediately writes in her report, of course, we never intended that this kind of work was worse for one kind of woman than for another kind of woman, or that we should focus only on white women. And she makes a very strong case that the council should change the name, and they do change the name. And her case is so strong, in fact, this is fascinating to me. She is not able to attend the conference in person in Toronto in 1909. And someone else reads her report. And her report says that we have to change. And the person who reads her report says, we don't really have to change. And yet, the council decides to change anyway. So that, to me, is a testimony to Eugénie Avril de Santa Croix's commitment and the eloquence of her writing, that she could convince an audience even when she was not there in person to read her own report. And when the person who read it reversed her decision, that nevertheless they go through and they change it. So, I want to know more about how all of that worked. Who was that Japanese woman? Who was that African-American woman? I think with better archival access, I will be able to figure that out. And the last thing I would say is the phrase white slave trade itself. I've also been thinking about its genealogy, because I think it stands, like a lot of things, at the axis of a vertical and a horizontal. So vertically, again, speaking from Rochester, home of Susan B. Anthony, where our other great local icon is Frederick Douglass. In the United States, historically, I would say that white slave trade was coined as a phrase by people who had been involved in the fight against the black slave trade. They were like, okay, we did this, the fight against the black slave trade, we abolished slavery. Now we will do this other thing, the traffic in women. And with racial blinders on, they called it the white slave trade.
Also got public behind it, right? If you call it slavery, then, yeah.
Right, absolutely. But then simultaneously, that happens at a moment of increasing imperial expansion and increasing colonialization. And so then white slave trade also has not just the vertical successor to black slave trade, but also the horizontal whites in the world as opposed to everybody else in the world. And trying to think about those two valences, I think that's a whole linguistic, genealogical, intellectual, historical project that I haven't finished yet, but I think it will add insight when I've worked it all out.
It's also a very Protestant one.
Yes.
Very white Protestant one.
The thing about the person that disagreed with the point of view, reading the point of view, reminded me of Judy's point about the translator pretending to be a woman when in fact he's a man, right?
I know.
Oh my gosh.
What do you make of that?
What
do you make of that? It's so weird.
It is totally weird. Did he feel like I mean, I guess to use a female name or a gender ambiguous name is one thing, but to really say, oh, well, a man can't do this while he's doing it as a man, I don't know.
This seems to be something of a convention. I mean, I don't want to hijack this, but it's something of a convention in pornography, sort of adopting identities that are not yours. They're sort of counterfeit.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. I did have another question for Judy, if I can just jump in with this since we're on her paper. You talk about the sort of the reversal where a woman is the woman's voice. And so it's the story of Justine as a male fantasy and the story of Justine being a female fantasy. But in both cases, she is still the object of domination, right? I mean, I haven't read the story of O, I must say.
No, she definitely, yes, she is.
So in other words, it's not, I mean, to me, when you talked about a reversal because it's a woman, I thought, okay, so she's going to be dominating. I mean, I just wonder.
Yeah, no, it's a more kind of subtle and maybe persuasive, maybe not. You know, I don't want to get stuck making the argument that Story of O is a feminist text. I mean, I do think we need to, kind of complicate our notions of, where feminism can come from and where it can go and what it can get stuck on and all of that. But oh yes, she is absolutely dominated. But that's eroticized and willed and in all kinds of ways that I'm sure that Alice, for instance, would find completely hair-raising, and which I will say I found very hard to read.
Please do not underestimate me. I'm not a naive person. Neither. I mean, I have traveled the world and lived in all sorts of situations and done all sorts of things in my life, including writing about nude beaches in an essay that came out only in French in Journal de la Société des Oceanistes.
Wow.
But and I am very interested. I had a friend once back when I was in graduate school she was, I'm not going to reveal her name, but she was like, gosh, I really want to write about this book, the story of O, but I just can't. I can't do it. So I'm interested that you're doing that, Judy. And, times have changed. That was a while ago now. That was several decades back. And she was still a junior academic.
Oh, interesting.
I'm not going to say who it was. Maybe if she hears this, she'll fess up sometime.
Right, or you and I can have a private conversation because I probably know her.
I also wrote a paper once called Intimate Matters on trying to take on this topic, but also with the Joan Scott's preoccupation with international relations. And I couldn't find any, it's just on SSRN because no one would touch it in terms of publication. Because I don't know if it was like a little bit too explicit or something. So I mean, that's the third rail that you're talking about. What I wanted to ask you was, how do you see the lay of the land then? What's your shape? If the erotic is the third rail, then what is the shape of the kind of historiographical dynamic for feminism? Does it just dead end, or is there some kind of give and take where rights and eroticism work together and achieve greater freedoms for women?
Well, of course, with the erotic or the sexual, what freedom means is pretty complicated, right? I don't want to say that it is the third rail. I think it becomes the third rail in the 70s, right? For reasons that one needs to sort of lay out clearly. I don't think it's always sort of,
like authors who pop into your head.
Sure, Dworkin, McKinnon, all of those characters, right? I mean, because it's translated and comes out in the States in '65. It's defended by Sontag, and then it runs into Millett, and then later Dworkin and McKinnon. I mean, it among other things. So I think the very important and very difficult, the whole pleasure and danger debates of the 70s and 80s, which are part of which are a moment in the history of feminisms colliding with each other.
Dworkin is having a revival.
I know, I've noticed that.
Yeah.
And that might be a way for us, because we for our last 5 minutes, to think about, I know it goes by so quickly, because you raised the question of sort of the historical deployment of feminism. So I wonder if that's something you think about, because au clair is clearly, to understand her, we need to understand an entire trajectory, or to think genealogically in the case of Horry, just as I think sort of thinking about the International Council of Women means also thinking about how the war disrupts and doesn't lines of continuity. So not, as you said, sort of thinking in terms, I wonder if you had thoughts on this, the historical writing or writing genealogically, or on the enduring topic of sex, against which feminisms always are especially contested, on the question of sex, whether it be trafficking or pleasure, from the white slave trade to Dworkin, to erotica, or to au clair.
Starting with Adam and Eve. Let's start with Adam and Eve.
Let's start. You were breaking up, Alice.
Oh, I said let's start with Adam and Eve. If we want to talk about the problematic of sex in relationship to, and let's talk about human rights. Like, I think that's part of where the conversation maybe starts to go bad. Like, just talking about sex in terms of feminism is really unfair. You have to talk about sex in terms of human rights. It's not just on women, right? It's not a burden. It should not. That's what Daly's trying to tell us when she's like, women are the original scapegoat. That thrust upon women to bear that burden of body shame or patriarchal ownership of the body, or what have you. It's not, that should be cast off, right? And we should talk in terms of humanity and sexuality and rights, I think would be more helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's speaking too broadly, I suppose, but it is true that all major world religions, I emphasize, in their conservative variation. Okay, I'm not saying all religion, but in their conservative variation, all world religions preach male supremacism, and that story of the myth of Adam and Eve is widely deployed. It's common to a lot of religions, but I've read the text. Each tradition, eventually, you come to the part where, but women are subordinate, and to me that's enduring and needs to be overcome. I think of Mary Beard and her book.
Alice, if I may stop you so we can hear from everyone before we wrap up, because you raised a question of history of religion and human rights. Sarah?
I want to go back to the sex.
Yeah.
Partly because when I'm reading Judy, I'm thinking about this immensely popular series of books, the Shades of Grey, or whatever it is.
50 Shades of Grey.
Right.
Also written by a woman.
Yep.
So it's like, does it ever, I don't know, I just wanted to see your take on that as a current manifestation, maybe.
Yeah, I plainly have to do that, but for all kinds of reasons, locked in that house, my family, I don't feel like I can sit here and watch, 50 Shades.
I think I even picked up the book and tried to read it, but I couldn't. It just.
Really?
I couldn't. So, I mean, but, you know, under the guise of female eroticism, you know, that sort of is an expression of it, I found it, you know, just completely off-putting.
Well, right, but one has to look at female eroticism not as something expressing, you know, it's sort of a deployment, it's a masquerade, right? The fact that it's female adds to its, you know, kind of erotic charge, right? It doesn't mean that it expresses some essential female subjectivity. It's kind of, and thinking through how that works and how that gets involved with the kind of counterfeits and the name changes is interesting to me.
Right. Right.
Right. So you asked us about chronology and time, Sandrine.
If you have any parting thoughts,
sure.
Just as a historian,
yes,
and a historian
yes.
feminism.
And I think I will talk about that by connecting us back to space and the question of the international, the transnational, the global. Obviously, nations have histories and the relationships between them change over time. International relations has a history, and that changes over time, very much before and after the First World War, before and after the Second World War. Globalization has history. It's on the one hand as old as the printing press, perhaps older, but on the other hand, very different in a world of social media and Twitter. And in terms of how that relates to feminism and to sex, I think the founding conference of the International Council of Women in 1888, it was simultaneously a 40-year celebration of Seneca Falls in 1848, so a very American choice of date. And also a sense that 40 years later, there was a lot of work to do and there would be strength in numbers. And as this conference originally would have happened in Auckland, I think it's important to remember that the first women to vote were actually in Australia and New Zealand. And that is another thing, I think, that motivated international work, that women in each country looked to the example of what was happening in other countries as a way of trying to shame their own countries by saying, look, women in New Zealand are doing this, why can't we do it here? Women in Australia are doing this, why can't we do it here? Women in Scandinavia are doing this, why can't we do it here? After World War I, it becomes women across Western Europe are doing this, and in the United States, why can't we do it here? So that becomes a very powerful reason strategically. But then I think there are also movements that are closely associated with this international women's movement that are international not just strategically, but also by design. And here I'm thinking of the peace movement, which was an enormous cause for them. I'm thinking of the movement against the traffic in women, where they really looked simultaneously at women within countries and women who crossed borders between countries. And something that we haven't talked about at all, but on the subject of work, we could say the labor movement. People who were interested in a minimum wage for domestic peace workers understood that in a global market, they could not have a minimum wage for women in their own country unless they assured a minimum wage for women in all countries, because otherwise companies would just outsource their labor. And that is something that I see as a true continuity, that the textile workers of the world, I think, are still mostly women, still mostly underpaid, and still mostly would benefit from the same kinds of interventions that feminists have been arguing for since the late 19th century, even now in the beginning of the 21st.
Thank you, Jean. I think our time is up, unfortunately. So hearing about international feminism, human rights, but also these idiosyncratic, fascinating singular figures that Eau Claire and Dominique Horry are. And looking forward to reading more about all of this. So thank you for all your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandrine, for pitching in so much and giving us such good comments.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Such great questions.
Yes.
Maybe we can continue this.
I would love that. I really would.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Okay, Zoom next week.
Or at least email this afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah, something
Right.
like that.
All right. Bye.
Okay, bye all.
Bye all. Thank you again. Look forward to seeing you in real time some other time.
Yes. Yeah.
Post-COVID. Thank you.